We will halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt.
Nothing's changed. The circus moves on, rinse and repeat.
We have an opportunity to become Europe's Silicon Valley.
We can perhaps be a broker of some sort with Ukraine.
We expect inflation to come off quite rapidly in the rest of this year. Obviously, we want to see that happen.
What we now need is a period of stable, quiet, serious government.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll, starting today with, as we so often do, something new in the story about inflation. Something else is getting very expensive.
Car insurance. I'm slightly dreading my renewal. Why is it so expensive? It's pretty staggering. EY's got this new report out saying that premiums are going to go up by 16% this year and then 11% next year.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's yet again something else that's getting very expensive. The Associated British Insurance saying the average car cover is now £511. Car insurance, apparently the third biggest household bill behind council tax and energy. And the thing is, of course, it's a renewal thing, so you don't necessarily think about it until all of a sudden you get the quote and realise that it's costing you much more than it did last year.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the cost of living issue is front and centre, but it's not something that is thought about that often because it in the inflation figures in the UK, it actually gets dumped into this basket that's just miscellaneous.
So I also find myself frequently in that basket. But I mean, look, it's one part of the story. We're going to be talking a little bit later on about the latest figures in the property market. That's another, mortgages, something else getting very expensive that we've talked a lot about first. We want to turn, though, to the Foreign Secretary's trip to China next, there for his official visit. We talked about it on the show yesterday. It's coming at a time when Britain's relationship with China has been strained, but a thaw in tensions between Washington and Beijing may provide an opening for the UK. James Cleverly has been speaking to Bloomberg's China government editor, Colin Murphy.
This is my first trip to Beijing, but I'm having a continuation of meetings that I have had with senior representatives of the Chinese government since I've become Foreign Secretary. And this is about engaging directly with the Chinese government, building lines of communication, addressing the areas where we have disagreements, but also looking at opportunities to work together on some of the major issues affecting both our countries and the world, whether that be climate change, the resolution of the war in Ukraine, or indeed the opportunity to build our economies.
Right, on the war in Ukraine, yesterday Bloomberg reported that Russian President Putin is coming to Beijing in October for the BRI forum. This will be his first trip since the ICC handed down the warrant for his arrest. So my question would be, how concerned are you that your visit here could be seen as endorsing efforts by Beijing to give the Russian leader aid and comfort?
Well, my visit here is about the bilateral relationship between the UK and China. In my meetings, both here and in previous meetings in the UK, I have said that Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine cannot be justified by Moscow or indeed anywhere else. It is creating food insecurity around the world, and that no government should do anything or be seen to do anything which legitimizes in any way Putin's actions. I think my counterparts in the Chinese government understand the damaging effect that Putin's actions are having on the globe, and I hope that they would join us in doing everything we can to bring this war to a fair and pacey conclusion where Ukraine gets its country back.
Did you have specific discussions around this topic already? And what was the reaction to this?
Well, I had in the conversations I had with the Vice President this morning, I did talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I made it clear that it is causing disruption globally. And I continue to encourage China to stand by the positions that it has already taken, territorial integrity, national sovereignty, the non-use of nuclear weapons, and I will continue working as a representative of the British government to try and bring a coalition of support to bring this war to a conclusion such that Ukraine gets its country back.
I'd like to ask about the parliamentary report that came out yesterday in which it referred to Taiwan as an independent country. Given the timing of this, and you're now in Beijing, is this a little bit awkward that this report has come out and referred to Taiwan as an independent country?
Well, I think your viewers should understand that that report is produced by a cross-party committee that scrutinises the UK government. That is not a UK government document. The UK government's position has remained consistent, that there should be no unilateral change to the status quo, that any changes should be done through discussion on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. So the UK government's position has been consistent now for a very, very long time.
Have you invited anybody from the Chinese government to this AI forum in London in November? What has been the reaction, and can that be effective if there isn't any Chinese presence at that forum?
Well, AI is something which will affect everyone across the globe, including here in China and, of course, in the UK. So it's in everybody's interests that we get this right. This is a groundbreaking AI security summit hosted by Prime Minister Sunak, and the details of the invitations are still to be completely finalised, but we are working quickly to make sure that it is both effective and comprehensive, and of course we'll be discussing issues about AI and cyber and technology whilst I'm here in Beijing.
That was the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, speaking to Bloomberg's Colin Murphy in Beijing.
Well, for more reaction to this trip, we spoke to the Conservative MP Tim Lawton, who is a member of the Home Affairs Select Committee, was also the former chairman of that committee. He is one of the British MPs who has been sanctioned by Beijing for speaking out over human rights abuses, what China has described as spreading lies and disinformation. We talked to him about what he thinks of James Cleverly's trip to Beijing and the discussions around the UK and China's relationship.
I think cautiously is the word. We recently had a meeting with the Foreign Secretary, those 5 MPs and 2 members of the House of Lords who've been sanctioned by China for over 2 years now. We're obviously concerned with his trip to Beijing. He assured us, and he's said it publicly since, that one of his priorities is going to be to raise the issue of why members of Parliament who have just exercised our right of freedom of speech to speak out against human rights abuses by China are still subject to sanctions. But I think our message to the Foreign Secretary is we cannot treat China like any other nation with whom we do business. So we need to be exceedingly cautious, and there needs to be a very full agenda of those issues where we have real concerns about the way China treats its citizens and the rest of the world before we can be talking about trade negotiations and other business links.
But it is also the world's second largest economy, so there is an interest in the UK economy of having closer ties with China. How should the Foreign Secretary be balancing those two things?
Well, that's where diplomacy comes in, and the fact that China's the second largest economy, it doesn't mean that we have to trade with it whatever, because the other trading partners we have do not have the sorts of human rights abuses attached to them. Our other major trading partners have not been condemned for committing genocide on various fronts. Our other trading partners do not have tentacles which have tried to compromise our security arrangements. In the United Kingdom have tried to influence businesses, local authorities, schools, campuses in a way that is not helpful to the UK. So, of course, we cannot ignore the fact that China is such a large trading partner. But the reason China is such a large economy is because the West has bought an awful lot of its stuff and become reliant on its stuff in recent years. And recent events, not least with Ukraine, just shows that that's quite foolhardy, and we need to diversify those partners that we trade with in the future.
Does the British government have a clear enough view, a unified enough strategy around China? And the US has become increasingly concerned. We're in perhaps a moment of rapprochement, but, you know, we don't know how long that may last. Does the UK government really have a convincing strategy when it comes to its relationship with China?
I don't think it does, and that is the problem. The government needs to be absolutely clear as to how it views China, but not just to say things and to condemn China when we have the latest abuses that it commits, but there has to be consequences, because that's the only thing that China actually sits up and takes note of. So why is it that we haven't sanctioned key Chinese government officials responsible for the atrocities going on in Hong Kong, for example? They've sanctioned 7 parliamentarians for just doing our job of speaking out, but we have officials who are responsible for the injury, suppression and deaths of nationals out in Hong Kong, as well as obviously in Xinjiang province and in Tibet. And hardly any of them have been subject to UK sanctions, whereas the US has been much more forthright in sanctioning key officials and putting limitations on what businesses can actually do in China. And I'd like us to go down that route, which is why many of us have been sanctioned by China, are meeting in Prague this coming weekend to discuss international cooperation in our approach to China generally, because we need to be acting together on this.
Okay, is China a threat to the UK? That word has been extremely important, adopted by some Conservatives, rejected by others, including the current Prime Minister.
Yes, it is a threat, and it's not just me and other MPs of all parties saying it. And of course, we had a really damning report by the Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliament, which had done an awful lot of work on this. But those are also the descriptions from the current and former heads of the intelligence services in the UK. So this is not just political scaremongering. These are people in the know making serious judgments about the threat that China poses.
So why does Rishi Sunak not call China a threat? If so many thoughtful people are saying that, why does the Prime Minister not agree?
Well, I think that's why I say the government's policy is not clear, because the Prime Minister has been quite forceful in calling out China on a number of fronts. The government has stepped in to prevent certain Chinese company takeovers in the United Kingdom, and all that is good. But when push comes to shove, we have got to remember that, as I said at the outset, that China is not an ordinary trading partner and poses a threat to the security of people in the West, including in the United Kingdom. And it does need the Prime Minister and the government and the Foreign Office in particular to make that loud and clear, and to say that there will be consequences, and to make sure there are consequences from sanctions downwards if China doesn't change its ways.
When you brought these issues to the Foreign Secretary before this trip, what did he tell you he would say to the Chinese?
Well, he absolutely acknowledged the wrongdoing that has been inflicted on us. I mean, for all practical purposes, having sanctions against MPs, it means we can't go to China or Hong Kong. I have no immediate ambitions to do that. We can't have business connections with China. I don't intend to have any of that. But it's actually the fact that the Chinese Communist government has sanctioned parliamentarians simply for exercising something which we take for granted in the West, and that's freedom of speech against China's abuses, which everybody acknowledges. So the Foreign Secretary said he would absolutely make that case and say that there is no justification for the continuation of those sanctions. There's no justification for bringing them in, and they need to be removed. But the Chinese government are only going to do something if, one, they hear that, and two, that they are convinced there will be consequences from not doing something about it. So that's the disconnect we have at the moment. The government says the right things, but it doesn't follow through often enough with consequences for the abuses that China has committed on so many fronts.
A final thought. We're not that far off the next general election here in the UK. There have been a great deal of concerns about many election processes in democratic countries and influence, including from China. Is that an issue that you are worried about?
Well, it's a worry the world over, because China, we hear, is responsible for all sorts of cyber attacks. And the problem these days is these are invisible forces acting. It's not enough, China bringing its considerable military might to bear, it can wage an awful lot of chaos on the West through technology and through cyber attacks. And of course, it has a very advanced technological industries at military disposal as well. So, of course, we have to be constantly vigilant about some malign intentions which China could have and could exercise. So that's why we have to need to have a full and frank conversation with it, rather than just treat it as any ordinary trading partner.
So that was Tim Lawton, Conservative MP for East Worthing and Shoreham, giving us his view on the Foreign Secretary's trip to Beijing.
Well, let's turn now to the latest strains in the property market. We've had 2 reports out today showing that home sales, and not just prices, are on the wane. Mortgage approvals dropped in July, lenders approving just under 50,000 loans. That's the lowest since February of this year.
Meanwhile, the figures from the property website Zoopla show that UK home sales are expected to plunge to the lowest in more than a decade this year. Zoopla expects transactions to fall by more than 20% this year compared to 2022. Their data also shows that house prices are growing now the slowest annual rate for over 12 years. We were speaking to Richard Donnell, who's the executive director of Zoopla, about their latest figures and what they show.
I think a lot of people thought the impact of high mortgage rates would be on house prices, which are at their lowest annual rate of growth since 2012. But actually, the bigger impact has been on transaction activity. Some consumers can afford to sort of sit back and wait. Hence, we've got this sort of lower level of transactions at 1 million. That's actually better than a lot of people were predicting a year ago. A lot of people thought it would be much worse than this. So the appetite to move remains. I think transaction volumes only really start to increase once mortgage rates fall further. They really need to get below 5%, I think, to stimulate more activity to keep supporting sales.
Given the outlook then for interest rates, does that suggest that the slump in transactions could last for quite a long time?
Well, I think it's about how quickly, it's 2 things really. Consumers, are they being realistic about how low mortgage rates are going to go in the next 12 months or so? And will people keep waiting until mortgage rates get much lower? I think, we saw in this spring that mortgage rates got close to 4%, and that led to quite an increase in activity, actually. So I think we might have a sluggish rest of this year. I'm sort of more optimistic for next year, but I think what's clear from financial markets is that mortgage rates are not going to get as low as they were, and sort of 4 to 5% is going to be the new normal.
OK. What does that mean for the buy-to-let market? That's also quite interesting.
It is. Higher mortgage rates are also squeezing landlords hard. Around about 60% of buy-to-let properties are owned with a mortgage. It's really the 30% with higher loan-to-value mortgages where the real squeeze is coming on cash flows as people refinance. And a proportion of landlords are looking to sell. So about 1 in 10 homes for sale on Zoopla at the moment are previously rented properties. And that's landlords looking to sort of take capital gains and cash out to pay down debt or to reinvest elsewhere. So supply is very tight in the rental market. Demand is increasing with record immigration, a strong labour market. Also then first-time buyers struggling to access home ownership. So rents are running at about 9% year on year at a UK level. And rents are going to slow in terms of rental growth, but with earnings rising by 7%, it's highly likely rents could keep track with earnings growth.
What is the read across then into home prices from all of this? Obviously, fewer homes on the market means there are fewer transactions to track, but what is the trajectory looking like from here?
We've had a very dramatic slowdown. So house price growth is virtually at a standstill, plus 0.1%. If you're in the south of England, prices are falling by up to 1% year on year. But if you're in Scotland, prices are still rising by nearly 2% year on year. I think what's really going to happen is house prices are going to keep sort of tracking sideways to lower. Earnings are rising, so that's improving affordability from a price to earnings perspective. But it's all about mortgage rates and how quickly mortgage rates, how much further they could fall to stimulate more activity. But I think for the next 2 or 3 years now, house price growth is going to remain very low, probably with prices falling in real terms. Yeah,
I suppose the question, though, beyond that, that we've understood that probably since about a year ago, that there would be a significant slowdown and in real terms a big drop in home price values. Do you think, though, that there could be a more sudden shock, as there has been in the past, on occasion in the UK? Does this sort of slowing of transactions perhaps mean that there could be a more sudden shock to the property market in the UK?
I think the big risk to house prices on the downside is if unemployment were to suddenly increase significantly and the economy turn down. I think what we've had very tough mortgage regulations since 2015 that have stopped consumers using ultra low mortgage rates to bid up the cost of house prices to unsustainable levels. So we haven't had the big overvaluation that we saw in the run up to previous downturns. And obviously we've got now banks where it's a sort of forbearance first approach, the deal done with the government to allow interest-only mortgages to help people over these sort of payment shocks they're facing. So I think forbearance and the lack of a big sort of loosening of credit means that there's not a great chance of a big recorrection in prices, and we're going to enter this period of just very, very low price inflation, stroke price falls in nominal terms.
What do you think the UK housing market will look like this time next year?
Probably similar-ish to where we are now, but with hopefully a few more sales happening. I think, we've had a very strong 3 years. A lot of people have moved. I think the motivations to move remain. So I think transactions are likely to pick up towards 1.1 million. But I think if you assume mortgage rates of, say, 4.5% to 5%, I think it's hard to see, any big increases in house prices. They're going to remain low, somewhere between sort of 0 and 2%. And then transactions pick up, and that's what industry wants. Industry wants people moving, and the more we can remove barriers to people moving, that's going to be sort of good for the wider industry that serves the market.
So that was Richard Donnell, Executive Director of Zoopla, speaking to us earlier. Well, Bloomberg's Damien Shepherd joins us now for more, our specialist residential real estate reporter. Damien, is Zoopla right that this is a slow managed decline of the UK property market?
So I think this goes back to towards the end of last year, after the mini budget. There were some pretty hefty predictions of house price drops this year. Now, I think the point that Zoopla are making is that those falls appear to be relatively softer than perhaps some of the doomsday forecasters said at the end of 2022. But you do often have to take these sort of house price indexes with a pinch of salt, and you'll see that there is a variation across the country in the Zoopla report. We're seeing harder falls down south in London and the southeast than we are up in Scotland and the northeast. So there's more to it than sort of the number that meets the eye when you first glance at the report, but the transactions are down. We're looking at the lowest in over a decade if we're going by the Zoopla forecasts for the rest of the year, and that's not good for anyone. People are really struggling to get the money together for a mortgage because it's simply so expensive now compared to what it used to be. And there is a bit of a divide between buyer and seller expectations. If you bought a home during the pandemic when prices were sort of going towards their peak, you probably don't want to sell at a loss now, but then the buyers in the market are looking at the headlines and thinking, well, I should be getting a bit of a discount on this. So transactions are down, and that really can't be a good thing for the property market, even if those price falls are looking a little softer so far.
Yeah, and so that's why when we spoke to Zoopla, I put the question to him, does this actually mean that there could be more of a kind of sudden correction, more of a kind of crash-like moment for the UK property market? Because Zoopla was very much emphasising what a lot of other people have said, which is that this is going to be slow and ongoing pain. What's our view on it?
I think that is what tends to happen. The pain is going to be relatively steady and slow. We'll see more people now towards the end of this year having to remortgage at much higher rates. You bring into play the cost of living crisis, and you look at the what renters are facing at the moment, which are often the people that prop up those first-time buyer markets with surging rents. And I saw the other day that Section 21s are at their highest in 6 years due to the pressures that landlords are under. So it's all a bit of a mess, really. And I think if you look at all of the factors, this sort of slow and steady decline is something that we would expect to go into the next year, given all of the pressures that a lot of the players in the market are under at the moment.
How much is there a scope for policy intervention to mitigate this? Whether or not there's a will to do it is another question, but we've had the government get the mortgage forbearance deal. Can they actually do anything else about this?
I think when you talk to people in the property market about this, it always comes back to one thing, and that is the supply of homes in the UK. And anything that the government can do to promote more house building, I think will only be a good thing in the long run for first-time buyers and for house prices, because even in a market like this where mortgage rates are close to 15-year highs, there's a cost of living crisis going on, there is still an element of competitiveness because there's simply not enough homes. And you'll look now, there's several people looking at properties even in sort of the market conditions that we're in. And then when you look down at the rental market, there's dozens of people surrounding each property, and it's causing a real crunch. So on rental supply and supply of homes to buy, I think that is the heart of the issue here.
Yeah, but this is an issue of 20, if not more years. How does all of this affect home builders now? I mean, is there a way of home builders increasing supplies?
Yeah, well, I think later on today we're going to see Persimmon, their forecast to fall out of the FTSE 100. They've gone from being the biggest listed home builder in the UK to now the fourth from the start of the year to now. And the reason why is because Persimmon, their focus is primarily on first-time buyers, and to see how their market value has fallen really sort of, puts it into perspective that first-time buyers are really struggling to get on the housing market, and we're seeing that the home builders are really struggling. And given build cost inflation, it's tough for them to build right now. There's a lot of land bank to look at, but right now the conditions aren't great for home builders to be building at the capacity that they used to.
Okay, Damien Shepherd, our residential real estate reporter, thanks very much for joining us. I can attest to the pressure in the rental market, by the way. I came home to my building, I live in an apartment building, the other day, and there was a queue of people outside, which I was confused by until they said they were all waiting to view an apartment in the building. So that is the situation people are facing in London if they're looking to rent now. That is it from us for today. If you like this programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock, and our audio engineer was Marufa Hussain. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.